In the dust-choked arteries of the West, a man's legend is etched not in stone, but in the desperate choices he makes when the devil comes calling. This is the story of Jedediah Stone, a man who thought his past was buried 6 feet deep. But when he found a bride bleeding in the dirt, her white dress stained with secrets, he lassoed a wild Mustang to save her. He didn't know he was roping himself into a viper's nest of lies, betrayal, and a conspiracy that reached the highest office in the territory. He was about to learn that the only thing more dangerous than the open range was a woman with nothing left to lose, and that she was the daughter of Governor Harrison. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked ochre skin of the earth. It bleached the sky to a pale, hazy blue, and baked the very air Jedediah Stone breathed into a fine, gritty dust that coated his throat. For 3 days he'd tracked the ghost, not a spectre of the supernatural sort, but a creature of flesh and blood that was just as elusive a wild Mustang, a stallion the color of midnight with a spirit as untamed as the canyons it haunted. He called it Diablo, for it ran with the devil's own speed and cunning. Jed was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape. His face was a road map of long days under that had sun, the skin weathered and tanned with lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into the horizon. His hands, calloused and scarred, were deft with a rope, a branding iron, or the Colt peacemaker that rested heavy on his hip. He was a loner by trade and by temperament, his only true companion, the steady, faithful mare beneath him dusty. He sought the solitude of the open range, a place where a man's past could be outrun, if never truly forgotten. It was the shimmer that caught his eye. Not the usual heat haze that danced on the distant mesas, but a stark, unnatural white against the rust-red rock of the arroyo. Curiosity, a dangerous indulgence in these parts, tugged at him. He reined Dusty to a halt, his eyes narrowing. He slid from the saddle, his boots making soft thuds in the sand, the jingle of his spurs, a lonely sound in the vast silence. As he drew closer, the white shimmer resolved into a shape, a human form. It was a woman, sprawled near the base of a gnarled juniper tree, its skeletal branches offering pitiful shade. She was dressed in what had once been an elegant white wedding gown. Now the silk and lace were ripped, sullied with dirt, and stained with a terrifying crimson that spread from a wound on her side. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, spilling from an undone coiffure, and her face was pale as bleached bone. Jed's first instinct was caution. The West was littered with traps for the unwary. This could be a ploy, a lure set by bandits. He drew his Colt, its familiar weight a cold comfort in his hand, and circled her position, his gaze sweeping the surrounding rocks for any sign of ambush. Nothing. The only sound was the buzz of flies and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. He knelt beside her, the pistol still held ready. He gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. Her skin was cool to the touch, her breathing shallow, a faint, fluttering thing. A canteen lay a few feet away, empty. He saw the tracks, shod horses, at least 3 of them, and the scuffed, desperate marks of a struggle. Whoever they were long gone. He holstered his Colt. She was no threat. She was a victim. A bride left for dead in the middle of nowhere. He uncorked his own canteen and gently lifted her head, letting a trickle of precious water moisten her cracked lips. Her eyelids fluttered open. They were the color of a summer sky, a startling, vivid blue, but they were clouded with pain and confusion. They took him," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "They shot him." "Easy now." Jed said, his own voice rougher than he intended. "Save your strength." He assessed her wound. It was a gunshot low on her left side. It had bled profusely, but the bleeding had seemed to have slowed. Without a doctor, though, infection would set in fast under this sun. His small, secluded cabin was a day's hard ride away. She wouldn't make it on his mare, not in her condition. He needed something stronger, something faster. His eyes drifted towards the high mesa where he'd last seen the Mustang. An idea, reckless and desperate, began to form in his mind. Taming a wild horse was a brutal, exhausting affair, a battle of wills that could take days, even weeks. He didn't have weeks. He barely had hours. But Diablo had the strength of 10 horses, the stamina to run from sunup to sundown. If he could capture him, break him just enough to carry them, it was a fool's gamble. He looked back at the woman. Her eyes had closed again. Her life was a flickering candle flame in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Leaving her here was a death sentence. Taking her with him on Dusty was little better. The gamble was his only move. "All right, sweetheart," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Looks like I'm going to have to dance with the devil to save an angel." He made her as comfortable as he could in the shade of the juniper, placing his saddlebag under her head as a pillow and covering her with his bedroll to shield her from the relentless sun. He left his canteen with her, knowing the risk of dehydration for himself. Then Jedediah Stone, a man who had spent years seeking peace in solitude, turned back to his horse, grabbed his lariat, and spurred Dusty towards the high mesa. He was no longer a simple cowboy tracking a prize. He was a man on a desperate mission, riding into a maelstrom of his own making. He was about to lasso a wild Mustang, not for glory or for money, but to save the life of a wounded bride he'd found in the dust. He had no way of knowing that with every coil of the rope in his hand, he was tightening a noose of drama danger and political intrigue around his own neck. The woman in white was a mystery, and in the Wild West, mysteries were often just secrets waiting to get a man killed. The battle with Diablo was primal, a clash of sinew and spirit under the vast, uncaring sky. The black stallion was everything Jed had imagined, a whirlwind of fury hooves like thunder and eyes burning with a wild fire that refused to be quenched. For hours, Jed and Dusty worked in a grueling partnership, cutting off the stallion's escape routes, forcing him into the narrow, rocky confines of a box canyon. The air was thick with the scent of horse sweat, churned earth, and the metallic tang of fear. Finally, with Dusty heaving for breath and his own muscles screaming in protest, Jed saw his opening. He swung the lariat, the rope a living thing in his hand, a snake that uncoiled with practiced precision. The loop sailed through the air and settled perfectly around Diablo's powerful neck. The stallion reared, screaming a challenge that echoed off the canyon walls, and the fight truly began. It was a brutal ballet of leverage and endurance. Jed, using every ounce of his strength and knowledge, played the rope, letting the stallion exhaust its initial panic, slowly, painfully drawing him closer. By the time the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple, a fragile truce had been won. Diablo stood trembling and lathered in sweat, his magnificent chest heaving, but he stood still. His wild eyes still held a spark of defiance, but the fight had gone out of him for now. Jed, bruised, rope-burned, and utterly spent, knew this was a temporary victory. He had broken the stallion's charge, not his spirit. Fashioning a makeshift gentle hackamore from a length of spare rope, he led the subdued beast back down to the arroyo. The woman was still there, a pale figure in the encroaching twilight. Her breathing was weaker, her skin clammy. Time was running out. Getting her onto the powerful, barely tamed Mustang was a nightmare. Diablo shied and fought the unfamiliar weight and the scent of blood. It took all of Jed's horse sense and whispered reassurances to both the terrified woman and the volatile horse to finally get her settled, slumped against him as he mounted. He rode Diablo, leading his faithful Dusty behind. The stallion moved with a raw, barely contained power, a coiled spring that could snap at any moment. Every step was a risk, a new gamble. The ride to his cabin was a journey through a fever dream. Under the cold, indifferent light of the moon, Jed held the woman, feeling the faint, fragile beat of her heart against his back. He talked to her, a low, steady murmur, hoping the sound of his voice might be an anchor in the sea of her pain. He told her about the stars, the names of the constellations his own father had taught him, foolish tales to fill the crushing silence and to keep his own fear at bay. They arrived just before dawn. The cabin was a small, sturdy structure built of hand-hewn logs nestled in a grove of cottonwoods by a whispering creek. It was his sanctuary, a place of peace. Now it was a sick room. He carried her inside and laid her gently on his own cot. The soft morning light revealed the severity of her condition. Her face was drawn, her lips tinged with blue. The wound was inflamed, the edges an angry red. He worked with a desperate focus he hadn't felt in years. He'd learned a thing or two about patching up men and animals from a life on the trail. He heated water, sterilized his sharpest knife in the flames of the hearth, and poured a generous amount of whiskey onto a clean rag. "This is going to hurt," he warned her, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "But this bullet's got to come out." Her eyes opened lucid for a moment, filled with a raw animal terror. She flinched as he cleansed the wound, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. He worked quickly, his hands surprisingly steady. With a final agonizing probe, he located the lead slug and drew it out. He dropped the misshapen piece of metal into a tin bowl with a clatter. He then packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and comfrey herbs he'd learned to use from a traveling Apache medicine man, and bandaged it tightly. For the next 2 days, she drifted in and out of consciousness, lost in the grip of a raging fever. Jed was a constant, tireless presence. He bathed her face with cool water, forced broth and willow bark tea between her lips, and changed her dressings. In her delirium, she muttered broken phrases, fragments of a nightmare. "Marcus. No. The papers. Liar." She spoke of chandeliers and a governor's ball of a man with cold eyes and a promise that turned to poison. Slowly the fever broke. On the 3rd morning, he found her awake, her blue eyes clear and watching him. She was weak, but the haze of confusion was gone. "You saved me," she said, her voice soft and hoarse. "I tried," Jed replied, ladling some broth into a bowl. "Who are you?" "Jedediah Stone. Folks call me Jed." "My name?" She hesitated, her brow furrowed in concentration. "My name is Swaw." The name sounded practiced, as if she was testing it out. A flicker of something doubt-fear crossed her face before she masked it. "Thank you, Jed." Jed just nodded. He didn't press her for details. He knew trauma could steal a person's memories or make them want to bury them. Sarah was all he had, and for now it was enough. He told her she was safe, that she could stay as long as she needed to heal. A fragile trust began to form between them, born of shared vulnerability and quiet necessity. She was a woman of refinement. That much was clear from her speech and the way she held herself even when weak. It was a stark contrast to his own rough-hewn existence, but their quiet convalescence was not to last. A week later, a rider approached the cabin. It was Sheriff Brody, the lawman from the nearby town of Redemption. Brody was a man whose ambition was as wide as his gut, with a politician's smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He'd heard tell from a prospector of a lone rider taming a wild stallion and heading north. Curiosity, or perhaps suspicion, had brought him out. Stone. Brody said, his eyes flicking from Jed to the powerful black Mustang now corralled near the cabin. Heard you caught yourself a real prize. His gaze then shifted to the cabin door, where Sarah stood pale and watchful. His eyes lingered on her, a flicker of professional interest, mixing with a more personal, predatory appraisal. Who's your guest? He asked, his tone deceptively casual. Friend of mine? Jed set his voice level, his body positioned slightly to block Brody's view. Met with some trouble on the trail. Trouble? Brody dismounted his spurs, chinking as he walked closer. There's a lot of that going around. You folks hear about the governor's daughter, Abigail Thompson. Vanished on her wedding day, right out from under everyone's noses. Big reward out for any information. Jed watched Sarah from the corner of his eye. At the mention of the governor's daughter, she flinched, a barely perceptible tremor that she quickly controlled. She wrapped her arms around herself, her gaze dropping to the ground. Brody didn't miss it. His eyes narrowed. You all right there, ma'am? You look a little spooked. I'm fine, she stammered. Just a little weak still. Brody's smile returned, but it was sharper, now edged with suspicion. I see. Well, Stone, you keep your eyes peeled. Outlaws, kidnappers. They're getting bold. And a man living way out here with a pretty new friend. It can make folks wonder. He tipped his hat, but the gesture was a warning, not a courtesy. He mounted his horse and rode off, but not before casting one last, long look back at the cabin, at the woman in the doorway, and at the powerful black Mustang in the corral. The dust from his horse had barely settled when Jed turned to Sarah. The air between them was suddenly thick with unspoken questions. Her carefully constructed composure was cracking, and Jed could see the fear she was trying so desperately to hide. The storm he'd seen brewing on the horizon wasn't just in the clouds. It was right here in his cabin, and its name was Sheriff Brody. The lawman's visit had shattered their fragile peace, and Jed had the sinking feeling that the trouble Brody had spoken of hadn't just been found on the trail, he had brought it right to his door. The name hung in the air long after Sheriff Brody had disappeared over the ridge, Abigail Thompson. It was a name spoken with a mixture of reverence and pity in the saloons and general stores of Redemption. The daughter of Governor Thaddeus Harrison, a man whose political power was matched only by his formidable will. Abigail was the territory's darling. Her wedding to Marcus Blackwood, a wealthy cattle baron with land holdings that stretched to the horizon, was to be the social event of the decade. Her disappearance was a slap in the face to the governor's authority, a bold challenge that had sent shockwaves across the plains. Brody had made sure the official reward posters were plastered everywhere. They depicted a smiling, confident young woman with dark hair and startlingly blue eyes, captured in a formal portrait. The resemblance to the woman Jed knew as Sarah was uncanny and undeniable. Jed tacked one of the posters to the rough-hewn wall inside his cabin. He didn't say a word, just let it hang there, a silent accusation. Sarah, or Abigail, refused to look at it. She would busy herself with mending her tattered dress or helping Jed prepare meals, her movements jerky and her eyes deliberately averted. The silence in the small cabin grew heavy, thick with the unsaid. Jed's initial compassion was now warring with a growing sense of unease. He had risked his life for a stranger, and that stranger was living a lie. "He was a hard man, the governor," she said one evening, her voice barely a whisper as she stared into the dancing flames of the hearth. "My father." It was the first time she had acknowledged the truth hanging between them. Jed stopped sharpening his knife and looked at her. "He's offering a $5,000 reward for you." He stated his tone neutral. A man could buy a lot of peace with that kind of money. Her head snapped up, her blue eyes flashing with a mix of fear and defiance. "Is that what you want?" "Money. What I want is the truth." Jed countered, his voice low and steady. "I pulled a bullet out of you. I fought a devil horse to get you here. I fed you and I kept you safe from a man who smells lies like a wolf smells blood. I figure that it earns me the truth." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of frustration and terror. "The truth will get us both killed. The lies are doing a fine job of it already," he retorted, gesturing towards the door, towards the world outside, where Brody was undoubtedly stirring up trouble. Her composure finally crumbled. She told him a story, a torrent of words that had been dammed up for weeks. She confirmed she was Abigail Thompson. The attack wasn't random bandits. It was targeted, precise. They hadn't been after ransom. They had been trying to kill her. The man she'd whispered about in her fever, Marcus Blackwood, her fiancé, was the one she suspected. "Marcus is ambitious," she explained, her voice trembling. "He is charming, handsome, wealthy. But underneath it all, he's cold, ruthless. My father approved of the match, saw it as a powerful alliance. But I discovered something. A set of ledger's maps. He was systematically driving homesteaders and small ranchers off their land, using forged documents and intimidation, then buying the properties for pennies on the dollar. Land that was supposed to be protected under the new Homestead Act." "Your father's act," Jed finished for her. She nodded. "The crown jewel of his political career. If it came out that his own future son-in-law was making a mockery of it, the scandal would destroy him. Marcus couldn't risk that. He wanted my dowry, which was tied to the marriage, and he wanted my silence. So the wedding was a trap. He planned the ambush on the road from the church to the reception." She continued, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "He hired men. They were supposed to make it look like a kidnapping gone wrong. They shot my escort, my childhood friend, Thomas. They shot me. But I fell rolled down an embankment into a ravine. They must have thought I was dead or dying. I just ran until I couldn't run anymore. That's where you found me." Jed listened, his expression grim. It was a story woven with greed and betrayal, at the highest levels a world away from his own simple code of survival. It explained her amnesia, a self-preservation tactic of a mind too traumatized to face the truth. And it explained her fear. It wasn't just outlaws she was hiding from. It was from a powerful man who had already tried to murder her once and would surely try again. Meanwhile, Sheriff Brody wasn't idle. Fueled by the prospect of the governor's reward and the political favor that would come with it, he made redemption his personal fiefdom of suspicion. He used the kidnapping as a pretext to assert his authority, questioning travelers, shaking down prospectors, and casting a pall of fear over the town. His focus, however, remained laser-sharp on the mysterious man in the hills and his even more mysterious female companion. Brody rode out to the Blackwood Ranch, a sprawling, impressive estate that stood as a monument to Marcus's wealth. Marcus Blackwood, played the part of the grieving fiancé to perfection. He was dressed in black, his handsome face a mask of sorrow. He offered Brody his full cooperation, his voice laced with anguish for his beloved Abigail. "Sheriff, anything you need," Marcus said, pouring them both a glass of expensive brandy. "My men are at your disposal. We must find the savages who did this." But Brody, for all his flaws, was a keen observer of men. He saw the flicker of something cold in Blackwood's eyes, the way his grief seemed too polished, too performed. He noted the way Blackwood's foreman, a hard-faced man named Cletus, watched him with open hostility. Brody didn't trust Blackwood, but he saw an opportunity. Blackwood was powerful. Aligning with him, or at least appearing to, could be profitable. "I have a lead, Mr. Blackwood," Brody said, swirling the brandy in his glass. "A loner, a drifter named Stone. He's holed up in the hills, and he's got a woman with him. A woman who appeared out of nowhere right around the time your Abigail went missing." Marcus's mask slipped for a fraction of a second. A dangerous light entered his eyes before being quickly extinguished. "A woman. Have you seen her?" "Not up close," Brody admitted. "Stone's protective. But from a distance, she fits the description. Dark hair, slender. If it is her, she might be hurt, confused. She might not even know who she is." "Then you must bring her in, Sheriff," Marcus urged, his voice tight. "By any means necessary. For her own safety, of course. We must protect her from this Stone." The words were a clear, unspoken order. Brody left the Blackwood Ranch with a new sense of purpose. He no longer just wanted the reward. He was now an instrument of Marcus Blackwood's will. He began to spread rumors in town that Jedediah Stone was a known outlaw, a dangerous man who had likely kidnapped the woman he was holding. He deputized a handful of rough men from the saloon men who were more interested in a payday and a fight than in justice. Back at the cabin, the poster of Abigail Thompson was a constant reminder of the tightening noose. The governor's shadow loomed over them, a vast, powerful force that could crush them both. But now another shadow was rising closer and more immediate. The shadow of Sheriff Brody and his posse, spurred on by the lies of a man who would kill to keep his secrets buried. Jedediah Stone had wanted the truth. Now he had it. And just as Abigail had warned, it was a truth that was about to bring a war to his doorstep. The town of Redemption had a single doctor, a man named Elias Vance. He was a portly, balding man, with spectacles perched on his nose and a perpetually calm demeanor that had soothed fevers and set bones for 2 decades. When Jed realized Abigail's wound was not healing as it should, showing signs of a persistent, deep-seated infection, he knew he couldn't manage it alone. The poultices and trail remedies were not enough. Swallowing his pride and his deep-seated distrust of towns, he rode Diablo into Redemption, leaving Abigail hidden at the cabin with his Colt and a stern warning to shoot first and ask questions later. Jed found Dr. Vance in his small surgery, the air thick with the cloying scent of carbolic acid and dried herbs. He described the situation vaguely a friend with a gunshot wound that had festered. The doctor listened patiently, his head cocked to one side. "It sounds like the humors are imbalanced," Dr. Vance said, peering at Jed over his spectacles. "A deep wound, if not properly cleansed of all foreign matter, will putrefy. I have a new poultice from back east, a mustard plaster, and a tincture of laudanum for the pain. It would be best if I saw the patient myself." Jed was hesitant. "She's in a bad way. Can't be moved." "Then I shall come to her." The doctor declared a statement of such simple professional duty that it disarmed Jed's suspicion. "It is my calling, Mr. Stone. A life is at stake." And so Jed led the serpent back to his sanctuary. Dr. Vance arrived in his buggy, his black bag filled with vials and instruments. He tut-tutted over Abigail's condition, his touch gentle and his voice a constant calming murmur. He cleaned the wound with a professional's care, applied a fresh dressing and the promised mustard plaster, and left her with a dose of laudanum that eased the lines of pain from her face and sent her into a peaceful sleep. "She is strong," Dr. Vance pronounced, accepting a cup of coffee from Jed. "But the next few days are critical. She must rest. I'll leave you a supply of the laudanum and these plasters. I'll return in 2 days to check on her progress." Jed felt a wave of relief. He had done the right thing. The doctor's presence felt like a small bastion of civilization in the wilderness of their troubles. He had even paid the man handsomely from his own small stash of cash. What Jed didn't see was the look in Dr. Vance's eyes as he rode away from the cabin. It was not the look of a healer. It was the sharp, assessing gaze of a merchant taking stock. The moment he was out of sight of the cabin, the doctor urged his horse not towards redemption, but towards a series of winding, desolate canyons to the south. His destination was a hidden encampment, a collection of lean-tos and smoking campfires tucked into a cleft in the rocks known as Black Creek Hollow. This was the den of the Black Creek Raiders, a ruthless gang of cutthroats led by a man as vicious as his name was feared Bartholomew Black Bart Kane. Kane was a mountain of a man with a wild black beard and eyes like chips of obsidian. He was not a subtle strategist like Marcus Blackwood. He was a blunt instrument of violence. It was his men Blackwood had hired for the ambush. It was his men who had failed to ensure Abigail Thompson was dead. Dr. Vance found Kane cleaning a Bowie knife with an oily rag. "She's alive," the doctor said without preamble. Kane looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Blackwood said she was dead." "Blackwood was misinformed," Vance replied smoothly. "She's holed up in a cabin in the northern hills. A lone rider named Stone has her. I've just been there, treated her wound myself." For years, Dr. Elias Vance had played a profitable double game. He was the gang's private physician, patching up their gunshot wounds and other injuries for a hefty price. But more than that, he was their eyes and ears in redemption. He heard the whispers of payroll shipments of wealthy travelers of the law's movements. His surgery was a confessional, and he sold its secrets to the highest bidder. His relationship with Kane was one of twisted symbiosis. "Stone," Kane spat the name. "I've heard of him. A ghost, keeps to himself." He ran a thumb along the edge of his knife. "And the girl, weak but alive. And Stone has that black stallion everyone's been talking about. The devil's own horse, worth a fortune." Kane smiled a predator's grimace that showed yellowed teeth. Marcus Blackwood had paid him to kill the girl, but Blackwood thought the job was done. Now the girl was a new asset, a living, breathing daughter of the governor. A ransom of that magnitude would be legendary. It would be far more profitable than Blackwood's blood money. And as a bonus, he could settle his score with Blackwood for the bad information. "You did good, Doc," Kane said, tossing a small, heavy pouch of gold coins to Vance. "Keep an eye on them. Let me know when she's strong enough to travel." The doctor pocketed the gold, his face betraying no emotion. "A pleasure doing business with you, Bartholomew." Meanwhile, Sheriff Brody's own web was tightening. Under the guise of official investigation, he and his newly formed posse of deputies, a collection of barflies and hired guns, paid another visit to the Blackwood Ranch. This time, Brody's questions were sharper, more pointed. "It's a strange thing, Mr. Blackwood," Brody began, refusing the offer of a drink. "My sources tell me the men who attacked your fiancée's carriage were professionals, not common highwaymen, more like the Black Creek Raiders." Marcus Blackwood's composure remained flawless. "That is a disturbing thought, Sheriff. Kane is a plague on this territory." "He is," Brody agreed, his eyes boring into Blackwood. "And a plague needs a source. It's funny. Kane and his men haven't been seen anywhere near here for months, until the week of your wedding. It's almost as if they were invited." The air grew thick with tension. Cletus the foreman moved to stand behind Blackwood, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. "That is a vile accusation, Sheriff," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "It's a vile crime," Brody countered. He was playing a dangerous game, pushing a powerful man to see how he would react. He didn't have proof, only a lawman's gut feeling and the whispers he'd heard on the wind. He was beginning to suspect that everyone, Blackwood Kane, and maybe even the governor himself, was playing a deeper game than he'd realized. He was a pawn, and he hated it. He decided then and there to stop being a pawn and become a player. "I'm going after Stone," Brody announced, changing tactics. "I'm bringing the woman in. Once she's safe under my protection, I'm sure her memory of the event will become clearer. I'll find out exactly who was behind the attack." It was a threat, and both men knew it. Brody was declaring his intention to seize the most valuable piece on the board, Abigail. Whoever controlled her controlled the narrative. As Brody rode away, Marcus Blackwood watched him go, his handsome face contorted into a mask of pure fury. The sheriff was a complication he hadn't anticipated. The doctor was a loose end. And the girl, his Abigail, was alive. He turned to Cletus. "The good doctor has outlived his usefulness. Pay him a visit, a permanent one, and send a rider to Kane. Double his original fee if he brings me the girl and the head of Jedediah Stone. I want this cleaned up. Now." The betrayal was complete, a venomous snake coiling around all of them. Dr. Vance, believing he was a cunning player, had just signed his own death warrant. Sheriff Brody, in his bid for power, had made a powerful enemy and alerted a killer. And at the center of it all, in a secluded cabin, Jedediah Stone was tending to a woman, trusting the very man who had just sold them both to the highest bidder. The fragile peace was about to be shattered by a storm of violence born from the venom of a serpent in the grass. The laudanum Dr. Vance had provided was a double-edged sword. It dulled Abigail's pain and granted her the mercy of sleep, but it also shrouded her mind in a thick, cloying fog. In the days following the doctor's visit, she drifted through a twilight world of fragmented memories and feverish nightmares. Jed watched over her, his concern mounting. The infection in her side seemed to ebb, but her spirit remained lost in the shadows. It was a shard of a dream that finally broke the dam. In the dream, she was not in the dusty arroyo, but in her father's opulent study. The room smelled of old leather and cigar smoke. Marcus Blackwood stood before her, his handsome face illuminated by the gas lamp on the desk. He wasn't smiling. His eyes were cold like polished stones. In his hand he held a sheaf of papers. The papers. "It's just business, my dear," his dream voice said, dripping with condescension. "Something a woman wouldn't understand." "It's theft," she heard herself reply. Her voice filled with a strength she hadn't felt in weeks. "You're ruining people. You're destroying my father's legacy for profit." Your father's legacy is power, Marcus sneered. And this, he tapped the papers, is power. Once we are married, this power will be ours. You will be Slant. You will be a perfect, beautiful, silent wife. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. She awoke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright on the cot, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fog was gone. The carefully constructed walls around her memory, the merciful amnesia had crumbled to dust. She wasn't just Sarah, the lost victim. She was Abigail Thompson, daughter of the governor, and she remembered everything. She remembered the chilling cold in Marcus's eyes. She remembered the faces of the men who had dragged her from the carriage, one of them with a jagged scar across his cheek. She remembered the glint of the sun on the rifle barrel just before the searing pain exploded in her side. And she remembered the lie she had told Jed, the lie about not knowing who she was. Jed, startled by her sudden movement, was at her side in an instant. Abigail. He used her real name, a test. She looked at him, her blue eyes clear and sharp for the first time, and filled with a terrible newfound clarity. My name is Abigail, she said, her voice steady. And I've been a fool. She recounted the memory, the confrontation with Marcus, his chilling threat. The pieces all clicked into place, forming a picture far more sinister than simple greed. Marcus hadn't just wanted to silence her. He wanted to own her, to use her connection to the governor as a shield for his criminal enterprise. The wedding wasn't just a trap. It was the final link in his chain of control. He never loved me, she said, the realization settling on her like a shroud. He loved what I represented: access, legitimacy, my father's blind trust. As the weight of this truth settled in the small cabin, another, more immediate betrayal was playing out on the road to redemption. Dr. Vance, pleased with his profitable arrangement with Kane, was returning to town in his buggy. He hummed a tuneless melody, thinking of the investments he might make with his blood money. He never saw the rider who emerged from the rocks behind him. It was Cletus Blackwood's foreman. He rode alongside the buggy, his face an emotionless mask. Doctor, Cletus said, his voice flat. Cletus, Vance replied, his smile faltering slightly at the man's grim expression. Is Mr. Blackwood all right? He's fine. He just has a message for you, Cletus said. He drew his pistol in a single, fluid motion. The doctor's eyes went wide with disbelief, his mouth opening to protest. He never got the chance. The shot echoed once in the empty landscape. Cletus didn't even break stride. He holstered his pistol and rode on, leaving the doctor his buggy and his secrets to be discovered by the vultures. At the same time, Sheriff Brody was making his own desperate gamble. He knew he couldn't take on Jedediah Stone and the formidable Diablo with just his collection of saloon deputies. Stone was a survivor, a man of the wilderness. Brody was a man of the town. He needed a better weapon. He needed the law. He sent a telegram from the redemption office, a carefully worded message addressed directly to Governor Thaddeus Harrison. Governor Harrison, stop. Have located woman believed to be your daughter Abigail. Stop. Held captive by dangerous fugitive Jedediah Stone. Stop. Require immediate assistance and territorial rangers to effect rescue. Stop. Extreme danger. Sheriff Brody. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. He painted Jed as the villain and himself as the heroic rescuer, cornered and in need of the governor's might. He knew the governor, a man of action and immense pride, would not delegate this. He would come himself, bringing with him the full force of his authority. Brody was no longer just trying to claim a reward. He was attempting to orchestrate the entire outcome, placing himself at the center of the governor's gratitude. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. Abigail was no longer a patient. She was a woman with a purpose. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice firm. "Brody will come back, and Marcus will not stop until I am dead. Your doctor friend Vance, what if he tells someone? The doctor worries me." Jed admitted his gut churning. Vance had seemed genuine, but Jed had survived this long by trusting his instincts, and something felt wrong. "He's due back today. If he doesn't show..." They didn't have to wait long for an answer. As the afternoon sun began to dip towards the horizon, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Not one rider, but several. Jed grabbed his rifle, his face grim. "Get down," he ordered Abigail. He peered through a small crack in the cabin wall. It wasn't Brody. It was a group of riders, hard-faced and heavily armed. At their lead was a hulking man with a ferocious black beard, and just behind him, tied to a saddle and looking terrified, was a young boy from Redemption, the stable hand who sometimes helped Jed when he came to town. The boy was pointing directly at the cabin. Black Bart Kane had grown impatient. He hadn't heard from Vance, and he decided to force the issue. He'd ridden into Redemption, snatched the first person he could find who knew Stone's location, and brought his raiders to the door. "Jedediah Stone." Kane's voice boomed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "We know you're in there, and we know who you've got with you. Send out the governor's daughter, and we'll let you live." Jed's blood ran cold. The doctor had talked. The serpent had not only betrayed them, but had sold them to the devil himself. They were trapped, caught between the approaching corrupted law of Sheriff Brody and the immediate brutal violence of the Black Creek Raiders. Abigail looked at Jed, her eyes wide with terror, but also with a new steely resolve. "He said, 'Send me out,'" she whispered. "He wants me alive." Jed nodded, his mind racing. They were outgunned and surrounded. A direct fight was suicide. But Kane's words had given him an opening, a desperate, razor-thin chance. He had one asset the raiders didn't, an untamable force of nature currently standing in the corral. "They want you," Jed said, his gaze locking with hers. "And they want my horse. We're going to give them a chase they won't forget." He looked from her determined face to the rifle in his hands. The time for hiding was over. The time for running had come. Their only hope for survival was to ride straight into the heart of the storm, to make a desperate gamble so audacious that no one would see it coming. The end of their sanctuary came with the thunder of hooves. Jed peered through a crack in the cabin wall to see them, the Black Creek Raiders, a dozen hard-faced men, spreading out to form a deadly circle. At their lead was the hulking, black-bearded figure of Bartholomew Kane. "Jedediah Stone," Kane's voice boomed across the clearing. "We know you're in there, and we know who you've got with you. Send out the governor's daughter, and we might let you live." They were outgunned and surrounded. A straight fight was suicide. "They want you alive," Jed said to Abigail, his mind racing. "That gives us one chance." His eyes darted to the hearth, then to the dry timber of the cabin walls. His home. The price of survival was always high. "Get ready to ride Diablo. When I move, you run for that corral, and don't look back." He worked fast, shoving whiskey-soaked rags into a gap in the logs, while the raiders were still taking their positions. Confident their prey was trapped, Jed gave Abigail a nod. He burst from the front door. Rifle blazing, providing a few precious seconds of shock and cover. As the outlaws dove for safety, Abigail sprinted for the corral, a blur of desperate motion. At the same time, Jed tossed an ember onto the whiskey-soaked tinder. The back wall of the cabin erupted in a whoosh of flame and black smoke. The fire, the smoke, and Jed's covering fire threw the raiders into chaos. In that moment of confusion, Abigail scrambled onto Diablo's bare back, gripping his mane. Jed vaulted onto his own mare, Dusty, and together they galloped away from the inferno, the untamed stallion leading the charge. They didn't ride for the open plains, but veered south into the treacherous maze of canyons known as Devil's Jaw. It was a landscape of blind alleys and crumbling ledges that Jed knew intimately. The chase was a heart-pounding blur of twisting gullies and flying hooves with Diablo navigating the deadly terrain, as if born to it. But Cain's men were relentless, pushing them deeper into the canyon. Jed led them to a defensible mesa known as the Altar, accessible by only one narrow trail. As they reached the top cornered, they saw Cain's men fan out in the basin below. But another party of riders was thundering into the canyon from the opposite direction. It was a disciplined posse, and at its head rode Governor Thaddeus Harrison, with a triumphant Sheriff Brody guiding him forward. The two armed groups stared each other down. The governor, seeing his daughter on the mesa with Jed, turned on his guide. "Brody, what is this? You said she was a hostage." Brody, caught in his own web, made a desperate play. "She is governor," he shouted loud enough for all to hear. "That man Stone is a dangerous kidnapper. He's taken her hostage." From the rocks below, Cain let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "A kidnapper," he bellowed, pointing a grimy finger at Jed. "He's just the fool who found her after Blackwood's men failed to kill her." The accusation hung in the air, a venomous truth that stunned the governor into silence. Jed and Abigail were trapped on the altar, caught between a gang of ruthless outlaws and a force of law that believed them to be criminals. The standoff at Devil's Canyon was set a bloody reckoning waiting for a spark. The canyon floor was a powder keg, and Abigail's voice was the lit match. "Father!" she cried from the edge of the altar, her voice ringing with undeniable truth. "It's true. Marcus tried to have me killed. He hired these men." Her words struck Governor Harrison like a physical blow. At that moment, a lone rider galloped hard into the basin. It was Marcus Blackwood, arrogant and desperate, arriving to witness a victory, and instead finding himself in the center of his own ruin. Seeing his fiancée alive and his conspiracy exposed, he made a final panicked gambit. He drew his pistol and fired not at the armed men surrounding him, but at the single voice of truth on the mesa above. Jed moved like lightning, shoving Abigail to the rocky ground as the bullet screamed past. That single treacherous shot shattered the standoff. The governor's men, enraged by the blatant attempt on Abigail's life, opened fire on Blackwood. Simultaneously, Cain's raiders, seeing their ransom prize targeted, began shooting at everyone, hoping to create enough chaos to snatch the girl. The canyon erupted. It was a maelstrom of smoke, ricocheting lead, and panicked shouts. Sheriff Brody, the snake in the grass, drew his own weapon and fired wildly his alliance to himself alone. It was a fool's gambit. He was cut down in the crossfire, a casualty of the chaos he helped create. Marcus Blackwood, the architect of the entire affair, was riddled with bullets from the governor's posse, his ambition ending in the red dust. Black Bart Cain, trying to fight his way out, took a rifle ball to the chest and fell from his horse, his reign of terror over. Amidst the bedlam, Jed pulled Abigail towards the back of the mesa. "It's over for them." "Not for us," he yelled over the din. They scrambled down a hidden trail of loose shale as the sounds of frontier justice echoed below. They reached Diablo and Dusty and spurred them away, not looking back, leaving the villains to be consumed by the violence they had wrought. Weeks later, in the quiet town of New Hope, a rider found them. He carried a letter from Governor Harrison, offering a full pardon for Jedediah Stone and a heartfelt, anguished thank you. The rider also carried a heavy satchel containing the $5,000 reward. Jed looked at the money, then pushed it back. "Tell the governor his daughter's life isn't for sale. I was just helping someone in trouble." The rider left, bewildered. Abigail stood beside Jed in the dusty street, the future an uncharted map before them. She had already written to her father, telling him she couldn't return to a world of gilded cages and political lies. "Where will you go now?" she asked Jed, her voice soft. He gazed toward the distant mountains, a purple smudge against the horizon. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere a man can start over." Can you ever truly start over? She wondered. Jed looked at her, at the formidable strength that had replaced her fear. He had lost his solitude, but had found a rare, hard-won purpose. "No," he admitted, "but you can always ride on." He offered her the reins to her horse. A new understanding passed between them. She was no longer a bride or a governor's daughter. She was a survivor. Together, they mounted their horses and turned towards the setting sun. Two solitary figures riding into a shared, unknown future, leaving the ghosts of Devil's Canyon to be buried in the dust. And so the story of Jed and Abigail comes to a close, but their journey is far from over. They rode away, not with a fortune in gold, but with something far more valuable, a second chance forged in fire and truth. Their tale reminds us that in the heart of the walled, untamed West, heroes aren't born from power or position, but from the courage to do what's right when everything goes wrong. It's a story of how trust can be a more powerful weapon than a six-shooter, and how true justice isn't always found in a courtroom, but in the choices we make and the loyalties we keep. If their dramatic ride for survival and redemption captured your imagination, please let us know. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves a classic Western with a twist, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales of grit, honor, and adventure from the American frontier. Your support helps us keep these legends alive. Until next time, keep your horses fed and your powder dry.